Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Professor Anthony Pym. I find myself in a position where I probably should not introduce our speaker for too long because he's so well known within our community of translation and interpretation studies scholars. But he is a distinguished professor of translation and intercultural studies at Rovira and Virgili University in Spain, professor extraordinary at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, fellow of the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies from 2010 to 2015, visiting researcher at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterrey, from 2008 to 2016, Walter Benjamin visiting professor at the University of Vienna in 2015. He was also a president of the European Society for Translation and Studies from 2010 to 2016. And above all, he is the author or co-editor of 31 books. And let me just mention a few of these. What is Translation History? A Trust-Based Approach. And this is co-edited. And also a book in Spanish, Normas Recomendadas para trabajar con intérpretes judiciales. And I have the third book, Understanding the Experiences and Communication of Interculturally and Linguistically Diverse Communities During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So a very crucial and current topic, and this is a report. And I've personally read quite a few publications by our guests. And just to add that he has published 237 articles, which I find amazing as a researcher myself. So without further ado, Professor Pym, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a great honor and a privilege to be invited to speak at the 50th birthday party of the Institute of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warsaw. And I'm very pleased to do it for more than one reason. You have a great track record. You guys have got a very beautiful building, I notice. And I think you're doing exactly what all of us should be doing. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. You teach languages and you do translation and you do interpreting. And I'm really interested in that relationship between translation studies and particularly additional language learning. That's what I want to focus on. That's where I want to get to. Now, 50 years from 2022 puts us back in 1972, right? And in 1972, I was leaving secondary school, so I wasn't in translation studies. I came in a bit later, okay? But 1972 is an important date for European translation studies because it marks the first oral presentation of James Holmes's paper on the name and nature of translation studies. And that's what I want to start from today. It's a good starting point. I hope you can all see that on the screen now. Is that okay? Yes, they said, or nobody complains. So there you go. You've got.
Yes, everything is fine.
Presentation of Holmes's 1972 paper. And you will see a certain hope for an academic discipline. And what I want to do in the first part of my talk today is explain what's happened in general lines to that academic discipline over the past 50 years, and really to ask whether or not we've lived up to that kind of expectation, or have we gone on to do something very different? And I'm particularly interested in speaking to people from outside of translation studies, people in language education, firstly, but also people in literary studies as well. Now, this is a peculiar map because It was developed by somebody coming from literary studies. And a literary scholar these days would never do something like this, would never try to organize something that looks like a science with its theoretical and applied parts, with its descriptions feeding into the theory and some kind of conceptual elaboration going over to applied extensions, as we can see on the right there. Literary studies certainly doesn't work like that. It's more like get your theory, find the text, find the examples, elaborate it, produce a discourse and propagate the discourse against other discourses. This, though, was a kind of appeal to science. Science with a strong empirical component. And I do think that translation studies distinguished itself from general literary studies in the 1970s through that empirical component. You have all these descriptive elements down there. And in that was conceptually closer to linguistics. If we talk about applied linguistics or certainly language education, we might envisage something like this map with the descriptive studies, theoretical work, and certainly the applied extensions. At the beginning, though, this map was proposed basically by literary scholars who looked forward to working with linguists. And translation studies was envisaged as a place where all those people could find their position somewhere there. I wonder if it works like that. Let's look at that map and imagine some kind of historical bomb being placed in it. Where would we put that bomb? Here's an example. Statistical machine translation, and now since 2016, neural machine translation, has radically altered the status of translation in all our societies. And that would be happening, let's see, somewhere around here, translation age. Boom, kapow, the whole deal changes. But out here on this little limb out here, according to this kind of visual representation, it's rather difficult for the explosion happening out here to come back over to the pure theoretical and descriptive sides. It will get there eventually. People do pay attention to what's happening in the world. At the recent Congress of the European Society for Translation Studies in Oslo this past week, for example, there was a very interesting session asking, oh, is machine translation translation? Is it really translation? Might be a stupid question, but it's not. It's a very intelligent question because it's trying to adjust the theoretical component over here to what's happened over there. But it's only one session, one Congress by some very, very intelligent people. It's certainly not what's happening in the entire discipline. Now, if I want to take 50 years and cover what's happened in 50 years, you can get that from any number of textbooks, and I'll just go through it very quickly before trying to look for underlying tendencies and indeed causes. Back in the 70s through to the 80s, the science was very much science, and we called it a science. Neither called it a science, towards a science at least. It was equivalence, it was linguistic. We would be very close to contrastive linguistics or indeed contrastive or comparative stylistics in the Vinay double-nay tradition. And that was allied in those years with continued work on machine translation, actually in the earlier, prior to the 1970s. Later from 78, and especially in 1984, we had a shift towards scopos, towards purpose-based translation, which would look at the translator not as somebody trying to reproduce what's in the start text, but somebody trying to render a service according to what the client and reader require. An entirely different perspective, an action-based approach to translation. At the same time and in those same years, and following on from the Holmes map, we had the view of translations doing something within the receiving systems, not just linguistic systems, but cultural and social systems as well, leading to what Gideon Toury would then call descriptive translation studies. And both these approaches, Skopos and descriptive, both of them shifted the focus from the start side to the target side. And that's incredibly important. That happened certainly in the 70s and 1980s. And that basic message, that basic shift, that basic thing that happened within the discipline has not really got through to other disciplines. And that's what worries me, okay? In keeping with the descriptive thrust, we've had a lot of work on process. We've been looking at different media. We have, certainly since the early 2000s, we've had a lot of work in engaged or critical or activist translation theory and connections with volunteer translators, building on the insight that when we translate, we have two languages, two cultures, two societies, two or more, and they are always in a situation of asymmetry. There's an imbalance, and that imbalance concerns power. We're working, therefore, in a situation marked out by power differentials and hierarchies, and we as researchers are never separate from that. So from that, it ensues that we have to be aware of what we are doing in our own research, in intervening in that object of knowledge, and how are we positioned with respect to the power relations involved there. That has become an important part of our discipline, and I think in neighboring disciplines as well. We're certainly following on in many of these respects, similar things that have happened in linguistics, in language education, and I think in literary studies as well. Increasingly, we have a strand within translation studies which says translation is not limited to language, not limited to texts. We can look at urban architecture and see it in terms of translation. We can look at the production of all meaning and see that as a process of translation, going back to Jacobson's notion of semiosis, or going back to Peirce's notion of the interpretant. That general realm of ideas has been with us for over a century. It's certainly not going away. In fact, it's becoming rather active within all the various meanings of the term cultural translation. All of that has been happening. Now, that's an overview. That's our experience of 50 years in a nutshell. Why did that happen? What are the underlying trends? I think the first one has to be the awareness that our object of knowledge has been becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. From a start text with its linguistic features, we move to a communicative situation with a client and a receiver. We've moved out to relations between cultures. We've moved out then beyond language into all meaning production. It's happened. Whether or not it should happen, I don't know. Of course, I'm a player in this, so don't take my word as being neutral. Of all those things I just mentioned, I think some are good, and I think some are not so good. So don't take my word for it. Okay, I'm not being neutral here. In that widening process, we have paid attention to more media, especially audiovisual media, which are what's happening the most to shape our cultures in the world. And then increasing attention to people. In 2009, Andrew Chessman wrote a paper called The Name and Nature of Translator Studies, which is implicitly a reply to that Holmes paper of 1972. And what's interesting is if you go back to that map, we find no people named. They are things, they are objects there. At the same time, we've spread out from Europe. It was a Western discipline. It was a discipline very much based in Western Europe, certainly drawing on Soviet work, earlier on, and Central and Eastern Europe very much evolved in the smaller cultures. Smaller countries, smaller languages translate more in percentage terms. Therefore, it's logical that they would be involved in translation studies. Canada, because of its bilingual language policy, was very much there at the beginning. Later players have been the United States, which is incredibly multilingual, and indeed Australia. But then in the 1990s, it shifted from Europe and has moved all over the world. And I can map that by looking at the creation of programs for training translators, for example. I think we did something in the 1990s and we counted about 300. I kept a website until about 2005 and it was up to 500. And beyond that, I stopped counting because it was growing. In China, they were opening 10 new MTI programs, Masters of Translation and Interpreting programs every year. The whole of Iran then exploded with a lot, and it became more than I could count. So that spread beyond the West has been very much a part of the discipline. And then because of all those factors that I've listed, I think that we have moved progressively away from a relationship, a narrow relationship with employment in one profession, the profession of translators and interpreters. And that, I think, is one of the more problematic aspects. If we go back to the map and now look for those things, one, we don't find the people. Two, the historical processes are sort of missing. It's not in that visual representation, although Holmes did mention translation history. And one wonders, I think, whether or not the map still serves us, or whether or not it has been bent out of shape by those processes that I've just listed. Now, what's the underlying driving force? Is it the intellectual prowess of translation scholars who have been so intelligent and insightful that their works are cited by everybody across all our neighboring disciplines in the humanities? I suggest not. I think it might have something more to do with, well, globalization, with the massive increase in trade and immigration, general movements between language spaces. Any map you like to get of the market for translations and interpreting sometimes, but the numbers I have here are for translations. Any set of numbers you care to find will grow like this. Even through COVID, the market for translations has kept growing. And if you put it on a 50-year timescale, it's a huge growth. Is it surprising that a growth in the number of translations being done should feed growth in a discipline called translation studies? Well, on the face of it, no. We would argue that the translations are done by translators. That creates jobs. Students come in, they like to get a job afterwards, so they enroll in translation. And when students come in, there are academic positions. People have to compete for those positions. Therefore, we have the conferences. Therefore, we have our publications and our journals. And the whole show is based on employment in an industry. I think that makes sense, but I don't think it makes all the sense. I don't think there are simple cause and effect relations along the way. And I want to give you some reasons why. Yes, it's a success story, but if we look at what's happened in that market, as it has grown, it has become fragmented. It's separated. I did this in a study of the creation of professional associations, for example, where we might have had one association ATA, for example, in the United States. But progressively, we get separate associations for interpreters, conference interpreters, and then community interpreters, for sworn translators and interpreters, for audiovisual. And all these separate areas within the industry have been assuming their own identities. And the same thing has sort of happened within translation studies as a discipline. So there's a certain fragmentation that comes along with it. The other thing, that if you look for that close relationship, you might expect translation scholars to have, well, solved some problems that have faced industry over 50 years. Personally, I can't think of any deep social, cultural, or industrial problem that translation scholars have solved. Yes, we've identified a few. Yes, we've worked on a few, but solved? No, I mean, translation memory software was done outside of our discipline. The new avatars of machine translation are in mathematics, computational linguistics, not in our discipline. We haven't been the driving force behind any of the progress or problem-solving activities of the industry, I suggest. And then, if you look at the studies we have of graduate employment, you know, we train students at BA or MA. Most of the studies, most of the surveys are at MA level. And then you look at where the students go. Over all the surveys that I've been able to find, there is a sort of general tendency where at best 1/3 of our graduates become professional translators and or interpreters. I mean, graduates from translator training programs and interpreting in this case. At best 1/3. So, you know, there is no direct relationship between enrolling in translation and getting a job in industry. That's not happening. It's happening for 1/3. And the relationship might have something more to do of students coming in and thinking, well, I could study literature. That'd be great. Employment. I could study language and linguistics. Yeah, but teaching all my life, I'm gonna. And then translation. Well, okay, this is an expanding industry. It's practical. I like working with people. I like working with text. The illusion or the allure, I don't think it's entirely illusory because 1/3 is there, but the ideological attraction of translation has certainly brought us students, often more students than our societies can possibly employ as translators. So that is one of the main questions that I have about our discipline having been a success story. I think I'll skip a bit here, although I will make, when I'm aware that we haven't achieved everything we set out to achieve, it's often when I talk with people from other disciplines. And we know that from the very beginning that this is in Wikipedia, so it must be true, folks, that one of the possible origins of translation studies might have been that Congress in Moscow, when the literary people were arguing against the linguistic people, and they're still arguing, but still, somebody said, hey, wait a minute, what about if we work together? We could have a discipline like studying translation with the literary and the linguistic people together. Oh, good idea. Well, I don't know if it ever actually happened in the Russian field, but certainly it has happened internally to our discipline, and thanks to things like that 1972 map that I showed you. And it's been productive. Look, I've been cleaning out my office. You might see up here. That's one of our journals, Target, all right? It's, I don't know, 23 years of the journal, constant publication, constant high quality work, not all literary, not all linguistics. And this is the Benjamin's, we're going over there, yep. That's the Benjamin's Translation Studies Library. That's all, looking at all this work that we've done, all these tremendous debates and exchanges between disciplines that have been going on. firstly, I'm thinking, has anybody been able to read all that? And then after that, we have the age of handbooks now, when there are so many handbooks on translation studies that we're going to need the Routledge Handbook of Translation Studies handbooks so we can find our way through it. You know, the quantitative amount of work that's been done is enormous. But we still get people coming in from literary studies and telling us, oh, you know, really, translation is a creative activity and transformational. And you people are still studying accuracy and the linguistic equivalence. You know, you don't know. Yeah. I'm sure that's happened to you. And then I get people coming in from language education, and they're assuring me that translation is the non-creative process. It's purely based on linguistics. It's linguistics of equivalence, and that it has nothing to do with the dynamic communicative use of language. I'm not joking. I have this in Melbourne, where I work. I have massive opposition from what's called applied linguistics, just because they're unaware that we've actually done all this stuff in the past 50 years, and they think we're back at the very beginning where they think we should be. Even where I am right now, which is in Tarragona in Spain, at one point I tried to move translation studies from our language department to our communication department, because in communication they do journalism and they do audio visuals and they do a bit of marketing. And I thought, well, that's the place translation should be, because we are part of those communicative activities. And the reply came from them. They told me that, no, translation is a linguistic operation. It belongs to modern languages. Even worse than that, it belongs to philologia, that is philology in the 19th century sense of the term. So I think there has been a lot of work done within the discipline. We are doing some very exciting things. We've changed a lot, but our message has not got through to neighboring disciplines, not very well. And I'm worried about why that it might be the case. Why should we worry about that problem? Here is the thing. Take this number from 2018, do the calculations, and we find that Google Translate is rendering 0.69% of the words. No, professional translators are rendering much less than 1% of the words that are translated by Google Translate, and Google is only one of the many free, apparently free, online machine translation systems. That is, okay, even if we were training people for a professional translation market, that market is a very, very small part of what translation is in our societies around us. So I think that to be focused on that market is fundamentally erroneous, not only in terms of employment, but in terms of our social responsibilities and getting people to know what they're doing when they use these systems. Here's one map of what could be happening thanks to machine translation. It was done in China, and I took it from Li Defan, who's the lead there, 2018. There's the top market, which is going to work for banks and big companies and always make its money. There's the ruck of professional translators who are going to be working with machines, with machine translation, basically doing post-editing. That could be happening. There's some debate. I think this is where we are now. That's where when I translate, I basically post-edit, and I'm not worried about that particularly. Although there is a logical movement for people to go up to a higher value added sector and do things that machine translation can't do. That would be a logical reaction to the bomb that has hit our industry. The picture, though, that I want to show you is that one. It's more like this. This is the 99%. And this is what we should be acting on, I think, as scholars. We should be looking at it and dealing with it in our educational responsibilities and in the research that we do. So that's what worries me, a narrow focus on the top profession and thinking that, you know, there's a plethora of bridge the gap studies. This is what industry wants, therefore these are the things we have to produce so they get jobs as translators. You know. Well, no, a lot more than that is happening in the world. When I did the survey of graduate students, of all the studies that have been done on graduate employment, one of them that made me think a lot was this. It's from Zurich Applied Sciences in Winterthur. And it's small, it's MA, it's only 74, but they did it properly because they phoned the people and kept phoning them. They had phone numbers, right? Email addresses changed, but parents' phone numbers, for example. So it's a fairly stable group of 74. And what's interesting is that their main job, only 32%. So this is about a third, which is what I would have predicted, are translators or interpreters. But 43% have second jobs that involve translating or interpreting. And then if you go into the third activity, self-employed jobs or the gig economy, or we do it once or twice a year, 95%. Okay? What does this tell you? It says, well, you know, we're training people who can do it if they have to, if they want to, if it's well paid. They can combine these activities with other things, and the main other thing happens to be language teaching across the board. The other third goes into language teaching. And then they have these skills that they can use from time to time when needed, and people are doing it. That translation in our societies is no longer a wholly professional activity. It's something that a lot of people can do and are doing. And that's the bomb for me. That makes me rethink, what are we doing in translation studies? What are we looking at? And what are we not looking at? Especially by focusing on all those bridge the gap studies where our pure role is to provide workers for the higher end of global capitalism. Is it a success story? Well, yes, because we have grown and translation has grown. But we haven't looked enough, I suggest, at the work of the non-professionals. We haven't looked, I think, enough at the way in which we are not the only people talking about translation, but that in a lot of the cultural activities that are going on, often using machine translation, there are also users of cultural products commenting with each other on the translation or helping people with translations. Jurong Xiu, who's there, is my doctoral student looking at Chinese online dramas. And the number of people who intervene and comment on the translations, on the subtitles, and then the Chinese viewers who comment on the English subtitles to correct them and add explanations. We've got this wonderfully rich, cross-cultural, receptive activity going on, thanks to our technologies. And traditional translation studies wants to know very little about it. In fact, the big mysterious part, the big black box in translation studies is still reception. How do people receive translations? Do different kinds of translations actually have an effect on not just comprehension, because we know it doesn't, but on behavior change, which is the big question we've been facing in vaccination communication, for example. How do you produce a text so that it changes the behavior of the receiver? These are questions that we haven't really asked enough of. And things like this very rich online receptive activity, I think new things, they come around, they've come about through technology, and we haven't really been looking at it enough. And I then hasten to add, for all of you who are language teachers, you know what? All your students are using machine translation, whether you want them to or not. Whether it's just cheating on their homework or just checking it and using it as a big dynamic dictionary, why not? It's about time that we made sure they know how to use it, what it is, what it's good for, and what it's not good for. So I think there is an ethical responsibility for translation scholars to look over there and see what people are doing in language learning. Now, that's my main concern, language learning. This is from James Holmes' original paper, the 1972 one, not the map, drawn by Gideon Tiri. And he did mention a third area of applied translation studies. Applied translation studies was, look at that, what part translating should play in the teaching and learning of foreign languages. My former doctoral student and now colleague, Nune Ayvazyan, found this for me. It was in her doctoral thesis. Look, it was there at the very beginning, but nobody paid any attention to it. And then Holmes goes on, we should give priority to assessing the efficacy of translating as a technique and testing method in language learning. It was there. Mind you, Holmes at the time assumed that we would find that translation is negative in language learning. He said, well, you know, we should look at this empirically and get some data on it, but very probably it's not going to go anywhere. It's not good for fluency. It's not good for pronunciation. Don't even bother, and nobody really bothered for a long, long time to work on this. So that's where the bomb is. Over there, not just with translation aids, with machine translation, but I think hidden behind that, the whole area of language policy has disappeared from Turi's map, and it's under language policy, translation policy, sorry. It's under translation policy that we did have that reference to the role of translation in language learning. All of it spirited away by this visual representation of the discipline. And that, folks, that is, I think, where we went wrong. We went wrong, not just in that map, we went wrong in 1992. Mary Estelle Hornby at the Foundational Congress of the European Society for Translation Studies. I was actually there present when she was giving a seminar for, basically for people from Central and Eastern Europe who were in Vienna, and she gave her firm recommendation. Number one, she says, cut the umbilical cord with the modern language department as soon as possible. You want to do translation studies, you have to be independent, because we need an independent discipline where, I don't know, where we can do our own thing that nobody else understands. I think that was wrong. I think Mary Estelle Hornby had thereby created or helped create a very successful discipline, an independent discipline, but that just reinforced the perception of translation as a narrow linguistic problem. Let's see, a few years ago here, we had a specialist from Texas on CLIL, which is content language something. It's when kids go and learn art or do physical education, speaking a foreign language, okay? So they're doing an activity, oh, and you're going to use English, and you'll learn just by using it, right? And so we were discussing that, and I said, well, you know, do you think translation might be involved as a part of that? No. Translation is just equivalence. You know, here we're doing other things. All right, okay. That's the effect that all our work, all those books, all these 50 years of activity, that's what it's had. We've been doing lots of different things. We've widened our view of translation, but the others still perceive us as being back in 1972. Now, I was looking at the size of the language learning market. And interestingly, it is about the same size as a global market as the language service providers. So translation and interpreting are just about as big as a market as online language learning. But then for language learning, you have to factor in all the classes that are done in our education institutes. They're talking about online, the stuff that businesses do. And then if you look at the effect of language learning on the economy of English-speaking countries, the UK, US, and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the numbers of students who come in just to practice and get good at English. Language learning is a huge, 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 huge part of our cultural activities. And it is growing faster than the translation market. So, for all we look at that translation market and see, oh, we've got to follow that because it's growth and getting bigger and everything. No, there's a bigger market just over our shoulder there, which is providing more jobs and perhaps even more interesting jobs, who knows? Or you can combine the two activities, as I have done for most of my life. I have been teaching language and I have been translating. And the best time of my life is when I was translating almost full time and teaching translation in the classroom. That was a wonderful activity, a wonderful combination. But I digress. Now, I'm going to look very briefly. This is sort of on the home stretch. I'm closing now. I just want to make some notes on why there is deep resistance within language education to translation, why it still exists, despite recent movements in the field. Berlitz is still one of the big companies in that big market for online learning. Okay, it was founded by Maximilian Berlitz, and his method was very simple. He said, look, the best way to learn a language is to travel to the country, so come to Australia and learn English, but that's a bit expensive. So come to my language class and we'll only speak the foreign language, and it'll be like having a trip, but it'll be cheaper. Very good. And so obviously translation is entirely abandoned, 1888 back then. There's the direct method around the turn of the century. There's a whole bunch of theorists. The most influential was probably Jespersen, who presented the argument against translation, really saying, look, people want to be pseudo L1 speakers. Nobody's ever going to really have to translate. Nobody will want to translate. There it is. And then the assumption that translations don't make people work. It's just given to them gratis. Translation is too easy for real language learning. Okay, Otto, we're in a world now where those really very few, no. Everybody's using machine translation. They're all doing it. It's not just a few. They're all doing it. So they might as well learn how to do it well. And we can make those technologies part of activities that are far from gratis and are a wonderful way of exploring language differences and enhancing communication. If you look at the ideologies in language learning against translation, you find these assumptions. Languages are in separate social spaces. Polish is in Poland, French is in France. Learners want to be pseudo L1 speakers. Is that still the case? I very much doubt it, but anyway, people have many lesser expectations when they start to learn a foreign language. Assumption, translation restricts fluency. I think that is actually true. I will give that one to the people who are against translations. And that translation activities have nothing to do with activities like explaining, translanguaging, code switching, which is another form of translanguaging, or many of the forms of mediation. That is, translation is not a communicative activity, whereas other things that we do across languages are. I'll pay the fluency argument, but I won't pay the others. Why? Well, firstly, in Melbourne, where I work these days, more than 250 languages are spoken in homes. We cannot assume that languages are in separate countries. The languages are there in the multilingual, multicultural city. And our task is to make that city work cooperatively. So just from the outset, the assumption of separate languages is not going to work. And that the ideal of the pseudo L1 speaker is not necessary either. We want people to work together and understand enough of each other to get cooperation. It is assumed in the immersion methods that you can get rid of translation as a learning activity. These days, very hard. I think there's always been mental translation for adult learners to some degree, but these days it's not just mental. You've got the machine translation there. It's too easy. You're going to have recourse to it. It's going to be in the mix somewhere. What we need in these societies are not more pseudo L1 speakers. What we need are mediators who can get knowledge across and provide cooperation. We've been looking, as was mentioned at the beginning, we've been looking at the problem of vaccine information in that city of more than 250 languages. How do you get messages across that will create trust in the vaccination process? What kinds of messages are there? And it's true, translation is only part of the deal. A lot of it is re-narration, it's community elaboration by trusted figures. But it's not like we need L1 speakers who are perfect in the language. We need trusted people who can convey a message that has been relayed to them through professional translators, but then through all this secondary community-based elaboration that has become far more important. All we have to do is see that translation skills include explanation, and it's all part of mediation. And that has been with us since 2001 in a common European framework of reference for languages, where you have the fifth language skill called mediation, and within mediation you have translation, interpreting, and then various things that we would these days call translanguaging. There has since been a revision of that, which tries to get translation out of the deal and say mediation is something entirely different from translation. I think that is a retrograde revision of the text. I think the 2001 text is a wonderful document. And the final point I would make there is we have to insist that translation is communication. If I look at all those books, that's the work they did. They started from a point where translation was representing a foreign text. They certainly finished up with positions where translation is very much communication in its own right. And as we've seen, professional translation is just a very small part of a very much wider process. Now, if I were going to rebrand, I think we have to rebrand translation, not for translation scholars. I think we know what we're doing, more or less. I think we have our internal debates and arguments, but we recognize that there are problems that we can do more to solve. What we have to communicate to our neighboring disciplines are these very simple things. Translation is communication. If it isn't, what is it? That the spoken and the written shouldn't be separated. In translation studies, we separated interpreting from written translation. In the teaching activities, and teaching I mean language learning and or translation learning, translator training, you got to start from the spoken activity in situation, because the spoken is where you automatically solve the communication problems. The written comes later. We have to forget about trying to serve a profession. The professional translators have never liked scholars anyway. Let's just say, okay, guys, you go and get your money in your little companies there. I've got this wider society over here that needs my attention. We have to make sure that the technologies we've got are always integrated, because our students are using them better than we do. They're going to be using it as a learning medium, okay? We have to make sure that we're not stuck on narrow concepts of equivalence and that we have to deal with wider communicative challenges, such as how do we get communities who believe in conspiracies, how do we get them to get vaccinated? It's an interesting problem to solve. And we didn't solve the problem, but the communities themselves found solutions to that particular problem. And one of them is just using a full range of solutions, from very narrow equivalence to huge adaptation. Our basic category should be mediation, getting a message across, getting behavior change done, not necessarily equivalence. And I think that we have to be honest and measure what we're doing empirically. I have always been attracted to translation studies. I came from literary studies, from comparative literature. I found translation studies attractive because it has had a strong empirical component. That if you're saying something that's wrong, you can test it and the data will tell you you're wrong. It won't tell you what's right often, but it'll tell you what you're wrong or that you have to rethink it. Whereas if I think back to my literary studies, no, that didn't happen. Nobody was wrong in literary studies. I have doubts about language education too, empirically, because people don't do control groups or contrasted studies anymore. So I'll have a debate there with somebody. I'll just mention some of the things I have been doing. This is Nune, who I mentioned previously. Her doctoral thesis was on this problem, and she did find that translation activities actually increased class interaction, simply because when you have different languages involved, everybody has something to say about their language or an opinion. And that was a contrastive study. And Pinar is Turkish. I had an Armenian and a Turk working on the same topic. She did a contrastive study again, and she did find that translation activities actually increased writing scores, which was not expected by many people. And most interestingly, and Nune has found it as well, students are more in favor of translation activities than their teachers. My generation of teachers tend to be, basically because when I became a language teacher, it was immersion, it was structuralism, it was immersion, then communicative methods. Translation was never supposed to be used, but the students are coming in, they've been using translation for years, even before they get to us. So my fear is that we went wrong. Did they know they were going wrong? No, not at all. I think they were having good fun. This looks like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. This is descriptive translation studies. I don't know, I got the photo from Josie Lambert, who is there. And that's James Holmes, who wrote the 1972 paper. That's Gideon Turi, who did the map. Theo Hermans, André Lefebvre, Ramon van der Broek, Itamar Evans Zohar. Okay. They were having a great time because they were coming from, admittedly, literary studies, but from very different backgrounds, very different languages, very different cultures. Translation studies was a wonderful meeting place for them to exchange across their differences. And then if I get this other photo, which is the foundation of the European Society for Translation Studies, the differences are even more marked. There's Mary Stell Hornby, whom I just criticized, and but you have interpreters, Daniel Gilles, interpreters, his name will come to me in a minute, okay, and you have linguists, applied linguists. Yves was, I think, coming from sociolinguistics as well, and you do have translation scholars. Sergio Viaggio, that's the man's name. My point there again is that translation studies, when I entered, as I said, I was present at that conference, that's 93, 1 year after the conference. It was for me a wonderful place because people had different backgrounds, different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, but also different disciplinary backgrounds. And it was just great to learn about so many disciplines and confronting a common object. And I enjoyed my time in translation studies very, very much. What bothers me these days is that I go to conferences and I find people who have done translation studies at BA level, translation studies at MA level, a doctorate in translation studies, and they can only talk about translation studies. No, there's a wider world out there. There are more things happening, more knowledge is out there than in translation studies. I think we have, to that extent, been a victim of our success. We've created an independent discipline that has, in many respects, become too much of a closed shop. What's to be done? I think that we should, and this also concerns the problem of non-Western translation studies. I don't think there's any reason to say, oh, that's Western, that's rubbish, let's find something entirely new. I think epistemologically, young scholars, or if we're looking for work to do on projects, identify the problems that our society wants solved. That's the hardest thing. And then from there, I think we have to work with our neighboring disciplines. So when we work in Melbourne on the vaccination information, we have a translation studies person, a sociolinguist, and we have another person from medical communication. Okay, and there are others who are within those disciplines. Okay, but we are working in a very strong interdisciplinary way, and I think that is the best way I can get the message out that translation is more than it was in 1972. It's also necessary, I think, to do that kind of work in order to publish beyond our specialized spaces and to go to conferences that are not just our conferences in translation studies. That is, if you want to have a book in that brick wall, fine, put it in there. But it would be much better to get out and publish in different disciplines and get out the word and get exchange going between the various disciplines that we have around us. That's why I really love the idea of an Institute of Applied Linguistics, where you do language teaching and translation and interpreting. That's exactly the space we need to get this communication going across disciplines. And that's why it's been a very great privilege and a pleasure to speak with you about the last 50 years of translation studies. I thank you for your attention.